Daniel Whitfield was sitting on his kitchen floor at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and he could not remember how he got there. His back was pressed against the cabinet where Margaret used to keep her mixing bowls, the linoleum cold and unforgiving through his jeans, his legs stretched out in front of him like a man who had simply given up standing. Above him, on his cage in the corner by the window, Chester the African Grey was still talking, not squawking, not mimicking a doorbell or the laugh track from some old sitcom rerunning quietly in the back of his memory, talking, clear as a woman standing right there in the room with him. Tell him he was enough. Over and over, patient as a metronome, unhurried, as if the bird had all the time in the world and knew exactly why he was saying it. 3 days after he'd buried his wife of 41 years, her bird was speaking words Daniel had never once heard her say out loud, not in 4 decades of marriage, not even in her last conscious weeks in that hospital bed in the sunroom. He pressed his palm flat against the cold floor just to feel something solid beneath him, to prove to himself he wasn't dreaming, that this was actually happening in his own kitchen on an ordinary gray afternoon with rain threatening outside the window. His coffee had gone cold on the counter above him, forgotten an hour ago. The refrigerator hummed the way it always had, indifferent to everything. Somewhere down the street a lawnmower started up, some neighbor going about an ordinary Tuesday like nothing in the world had changed. Everything around him was so completely, stubbornly normal that the words coming from that cage felt almost violent in how impossible they seemed. And somewhere underneath the shock, underneath the grief that had been sitting on his chest like a boulder since the funeral, a question rose up in him that he couldn't push back down, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. If the people we love leave pieces of themselves behind in the most unexpected places, in a song on the radio, in a smell that stops you cold in a doorway, in the voice of a bird who has no business knowing what to say. Have you ever felt someone you lost reaching you again, right when you least expected it, through something you never imagined could carry their voice? 6 months earlier, none of this would have made a bit of sense to Daniel. He was a practical man, 68 years old, retired after 31 years driving a delivery route for a regional freight company out of Dayton, the kind of man who measured his days in mile markers and delivery windows and trusted only what he could see and touch and hold steady in his own 2 hands. He did not believe in signs. He believed in oil changes done on schedule, in Sunday dinners at 5 o'clock sharp, in the specific off-key hum his wife made while she watered her tomato plants on the back porch every summer evening, a little tuneless song she'd been humming since before their daughters were born. Margaret was the believer in that house. She kept the Bible on her nightstand with the corners worn soft from 40 years of handling, its spine cracked in 3 places from being opened to the same well-loved passages again and again, and she told Daniel more than once, usually apropos of nothing, folding laundry or driving home from church, that love doesn't simply stop when a heart does. He used to smile at her for it, gently, the particular smile you give someone you adore even when you privately think they've got it wrong. He never argued the point with her, not once in 41 years. He just quietly assumed she believed it because it comforted her, the way people believe in things that help them sleep at night, and he loved her far too much to take that comfort away from her, even in the privacy of his own skeptical mind. He did not know yet, could not possibly have known, that in the final weeks of her life, his wife would plant something living and breathing in their home that would outlast her entirely, something with feathers and a heartbeat no bigger than a thumb, and that it would one day deliver a message meant for him and him alone on a day neither of them could have predicted. Margaret had been diagnosed the previous spring, and the word cancer entered their house the way a storm enters a quiet valley, soft at first, distant thunder, you can almost convince yourself to ignore, and then all at once it's directly overhead, and there's no outrunning it anymore. Pancreatic. The doctors used careful, rounded-off language in that first appointment, the kind of language built to let a family keep a sliver of hope alive a little longer before the truth finally settles in for good and won't be argued with. Daniel remembered the drive home from that first specialist's office with an exactness that still frightened him months later, how Margaret had reached over without a word and turned the radio dial to some station playing old Patsy Cline, needing the sound of something ordinary and unbothered to keep her from coming apart completely in the passenger seat. They had married in a small Methodist church in southern Ohio back in the spring of 1983, when Daniel was 25 years old in a rented suit 2 sizes too big in the shoulders, and certain that 40 years together sounded like an eternity nobody could ever actually reach. They raised 2 daughters, Rebecca and Susan, who were grown now, scattered across the country in Charlotte and Denver, building their own careers and their own kitchens and their own quiet Tuesday afternoons, too far away for the kind of daily company that fills up an aging house. It had been Margaret's idea, 3 years back, to bring Chester home from a rescue outside Columbus after reading about him in a newsletter from a local bird sanctuary. She'd said the house had gone too quiet since the girls left for good, that she wanted something alive in those rooms besides the 2 of them and the steady, indifferent ticking of the hallway clock that had marked their whole marriage. Daniel had grumbled a little about the cost of birdseed and the mess a bird that size could make of a clean kitchen, but he never once told her no. In 41 years, he had never once told her no about anything that made her eyes light up the way the gray, ruffled, half-molted rescue bird did the moment she first held him. Chester turned out smarter than either of them expected, and it didn't take long for that to become obvious to anyone who spent an afternoon in that house. African greys are famous for it, the rescue worker had explained to them at the time, some of the most intelligent birds on the planet, capable of learning hundreds of words and stringing them together in ways that look, unmistakably, like intention rather than simple mimicry, like something closer to actual thought. Within a year he had picked up, "Good morning, supper's almost ready," even the particular 3-note whistle Daniel used out on the porch to call in a stray tabby cat that used to wander through their backyard looking for scraps. Margaret spent hours at that kitchen table with Chester, patient in a way Daniel sometimes admitted. Privately, she wasn't even with people, repeating phrases softly and evenly until the bird's head would tilt just so, and he'd try the sounds out for himself in his own gravelly, imperfect little voice. She talked to that bird the way some women talk to a grandchild who lives too far away to visit, full of warmth and absolutely no self-consciousness about it. And Daniel would come in from the garage some evenings, oil still under his fingernails from tinkering with the mower, and find her laughing out loud at something Chester had said back to her. Some phrase repeated in exactly her own inflection. Something in his chest would loosen just from watching her that happy, that at ease, in a house that had gotten quieter than either of them had wanted it to be. It became a strange, unspoken triangle in that home. The 2 of them and this bird slowly becoming family in every way that mattered, learning their voices, their moods, the difference between the front door closing softly at the end of a good day and closing hard at the end of a bad one, and what each one meant for how the rest of the evening ought to go. By the time the diagnosis came, Chester had been with them long enough to greet Daniel by name the moment he walked in from an errand, calling out, "Danny," in a rough approximation of Margaret's own voice, the only person left alive who still called him that. He mimicked her soft, there now, the instant the vacuum cleaner clicked on and startled him off his perch. The bond between Margaret and that bird only deepened after she got sick, the way people cling harder to small, steady comforts when the big things in life start slipping through their fingers no matter how tightly they hold on. She spent more and more time at that kitchen table, too tired most afternoons to do much of anything else. Her energy rationed out now like something precious and finite, and Chester became her quiet companion through the long stretches when Daniel was out at appointments arranging her care, or simply outside on the porch because he needed air that didn't smell like hand sanitizer and worry, and the particular sourness of illness that had started creeping into the house no matter how many windows they opened. She would sit with that bird for an hour at a time, murmuring things Daniel couldn't quite make out from the next room over the sound of the television, her voice low and private in a way that made him feel, though he never admitted it to himself in so many words, that something was passing between his wife and that bird that he wasn't included in. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself she was simply keeping herself occupied through the long, frightening afternoons when there was nothing left to do but wait for the next appointment, the next round of results. He did not yet understand that his wife was quietly, deliberately preparing a gift for him, one she already knew. Somewhere deep down, she would not live long enough to hand over herself. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday in October, 3 weeks before hospice care began in earnest. Margaret had been having a good day, one of the last real good ones she'd have, strong enough to sit upright at the table with her tea instead of staying in bed until noon, the way she'd started doing more and more. Daniel had driven into town to pick up her prescriptions, waiting in that same pharmacy line he'd waited in a dozen times that month. And when he came back through the front door, arms full of grocery bags he'd picked up on the way home, he heard her voice drifting from the kitchen in that particular hushed, deliberate rhythm she used only when she was teaching Chester something new and important, something that mattered more than "good morning" or "supper's ready." He stood in the hallway a moment without meaning to eavesdrop, just curious, just tired, and listened to the cadence of it, 4 or 5 syllables repeated, slow and even, the way you teach a child to memorize something they'd need to remember for the rest of their life. When he finally stepped into the kitchen, the bags, "It's a secret, just between me and him." Daniel laughed it off, the way he laughed off most things back then, setting the grocery bags down on the counter, asking if it was some kind of surprise she was planning to spring on the girls next time they visited for Christmas. Margaret only gave him that soft, tired smile of hers, the one that had started to look a little sadder around the edges in the last few weeks, and said, "You'll know when you need to know, sweetheart." He didn't press her on it. There were so many things in those last months he chose not to press her on, so many small private corners of her he let her keep for herself, because he could feel in his bones, even then, that time was running out fast, faster than either of them wanted to say out loud, and he refused to spend a single one of the hours they had left arguing with the woman he loved over something as small as a parrot's vocabulary. Over the weeks that followed, Margaret grew weaker in the particular, unmistakable way that tells a family the end is closer now than anyone wants to say out loud at the dinner table, closer than the calendar on the kitchen wall seemed to admit. The hospice nurse started coming 3 times a week, then 5, then finally every single day, her white car pulling into the driveway at the same hour each morning until it became its own kind of clock. Margaret slept longer. She ate less, pushing food around her plate more than actually eating it, no matter how Daniel tried to tempt her with the soup she used to love. But whenever she found a clear stretch of energy, even just 15 or 20 minutes on a good afternoon, she'd ask Daniel to wheel her chair over near Chester's cage, and she'd pick up wherever she'd left off, her voice thinner now but no less patient, no less deliberate than before, as if she understood she was running out of time to finish whatever she'd started. Daniel noticed, though it took him a while to admit it fully to himself, that she never repeated the complete phrase in front of him anymore. Not the way she had that first Thursday when she hadn't known yet to be careful. She'd catch herself mid-sentence, or lower her voice until it dissolved into a whisper he couldn't reach, even leaning close, or simply change the subject altogether if he lingered too long in the doorway watching her work. He wondered sometimes, lying awake beside her in the dark, listening to the labored, uneven rhythm of her breathing, what on earth she could possibly be teaching that bird that she didn't want her own husband of 41 years to hear even once, not even a fragment of it. It stung him a little. If he was honest with himself in those quiet hours, this one closed door in a marriage that had never really had closed doors between them before, not about money, not about the girls, not about the girls, not about the girls. But he loved her far too much, and time was far too short to make her final weeks about his own bruised feelings over a parrot's secrets. The day hospice truly began, the day the hospital bed arrived on a truck and was set up in what used to be their sunroom, because Margaret wanted to keep seeing the yard she'd tended for 30 years. The tomato plants now gone brown and forgotten in their raised beds, was the day the ground properly shifted beneath Daniel's feet for good. Up until then, there had always been a kind of terrible, fragile hope, another treatment to try, another specialist to call, phone conversations full of percentages and probabilities that let a man believe, at least a little, that things could still turn a corner if they just found the right combination. Hospice meant all of that hope had been formally, quietly set aside, folded up, and put away like something too painful to keep looking at, replaced now with the single honest goal of keeping her comfortable for whatever time remained, however much or little that turned out to be. Daniel remembered standing in the doorway of that sunroom that first evening, watching the hospice nurse gently adjust the pillows behind his wife's head with a practiced tenderness that made his own hands feel useless and clumsy by comparison, and feeling a loneliness so total it frightened him, even though Margaret was right there in front of him, still breathing, still occasionally opening her eyes to find his face across the room and hold it there a long moment before drifting off again into whatever half-sleep the medication gave her. That was the true beginning of the low point that would define the rest of that autumn for him, a slow, grinding grief that started long before her actual death. The particular Chester's cage was moved into the sunroom too at Margaret's quiet insistence, so she could see him clearly from the bed whenever she opened her eyes, his gray shape a familiar comfort against the window light. In those final 2 weeks, something in her relationship with that bird intensified in a way Daniel could only watch from the sidelines, helpless and a little bewildered by his own jealousy over something so small and so strange to be jealous of. She'd asked the nurse to wheel his cage close enough that she could reach a thin, weakening hand through the bars, and she'd stroke his gray feathers with 2 fingers, whispering to him in that low, private voice, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes straight whenever she had the strength for it, her eyes half closed, her lips barely moving. Daniel sat with her every single day, held her hand every single night, until his own hand went numb from staying still so long, read her the local paper aloud when she wanted the noise of ordinary life still moving somewhere around her, the school board meetings and the high school football scores, and the weather for the coming week. But this one thing with the bird remained separate, hers alone, and he asked her once, gently, near the very end, sitting on the edge of her bed in the gray morning light, what exactly she'd been telling Chester all this time, whether it was something about the girls or the house or something she needed him to know about money he hadn't thought to ask. She took his hand in hers, her grip so much lighter now than it used to be, barely a pressure at all, and she said only, "You'll understand soon, sweetheart. I promise you'll understand." 2 days later, she slipped into a sleep she never woke from, her breathing growing slower and further apart through that long final night until it simply stopped sometime before dawn, and 4 days after that, Daniel buried his wife under a heavy gray November sky, their daughters weeping on either side of him in matching black coats, and Chester left alone back at the empty house, silent, in a sunroom that suddenly held nothing but her empty chair and the smell of her lotion still lingering faintly in the fabric of the cushions. His daughter stayed a few extra days after the service, cooking meals nobody quite finished eating, sorting through condolence cards that kept arriving in the mail, but then they had to fly back home to their own families, their own jobs, their own lives, waiting for them. And Daniel found himself truly alone in that house for the first time in over 4 decades. The silence so total it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on his chest until breathing itself felt like an effort he had to consciously make, one breath and then another. He barely ate, forgetting entire days sometimes, surviving on coffee and crackers he found in the back of the pantry. Some mornings he wandered from room to room without any real purpose at all, picking up her reading glasses off the nightstand where they'd sat untouched, her cardigan still draped over the back of a kitchen chair exactly where she'd left it weeks ago, holding these small ordinary objects the way you'd hold something sacred and fragile. Chester, through all of this, had gone almost entirely silent too, as though the bird understood, in whatever strange way birds understand anything at all, that something enormous and irreversible had happened inside that house. For 3 full days, Daniel barely even looked toward the cage. He couldn't bring himself to. Every time his eyes drifted toward the sunroom, he saw Margaret's empty chair still angled exactly where it had been, the blanket still folded over the arm of it, and the grief would rise up so fast and so hard, it nearly buckled his knees right there in the hallway, forcing him to grab the doorframe just to stay upright. He was, in every sense that mattered, a man quietly drowning in his own kitchen, in his own house, in his own life, and nobody, not even he himself, could see a way out of it yet. It was the 3rd afternoon after the funeral, a gray Tuesday with rain threatening low in the windows and the wind picking up outside, when Daniel finally forced himself into the sunroom to refill Chester's water and seed, mostly out of guilt, telling himself the bird hadn't asked to be forgotten, along with everything else in that house that had gone quiet and neglected. He moved slowly, almost mechanically, sliding open the little door on the cage, his hands trembling slightly the way they'd been trembling for days now, and he expected nothing more than the ordinary rustle of feathers settling as Chester shifted on his perch. Instead, Chester tilted his head and fixed one round black eye on Daniel with an intensity that stopped him cold in his tracks, a stillness in the bird that felt almost deliberate, and said, in a voice so clear and so precisely paced it did not sound like mimicry at all. It sounded like a message finally being delivered exactly on schedule. Tell him he was enough. Daniel's hands froze on the cage door, his fingers locked around the little metal latch. For a moment he genuinely believed he'd imagined it, some cruel trick of grief and exhaustion and 3 sleepless nights stacked one on top of another. But Chester said it again, the exact same cadence, the exact same 4 words, unhurried and certain, and this time Daniel recognized, underneath the birdish rasp, the unmistakable rhythm of his wife's own voice, the particular way she used to draw out the word, enough. Like she was underlining it twice for emphasis, the way she'd said it to him once after a hard year when the freight company nearly laid him off and he'd come home convinced he'd failed her. His knees simply stopped holding him up. He didn't fall so much as lower himself in stages, one hand sliding down the cage stand until he was sitting flat on the cold kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet, staring up at a bird who was staring right back down at him, patiently repeating the phrase a 3rd time, a 4th, calm as a teacher who had waited months for this exact moment to finally matter. He sat there on that cold floor for the better part of an hour, the rain starting up outside just as he'd expected it to, tapping against the window glass in a rhythm that almost matched Chester's. And in that hour something inside Daniel Whitfield began, very slowly, to come apart. He understood, all at once, sitting there on the floor of his own kitchen, what those private weeks at the kitchen table had actually been. Margaret had known, somewhere in the last months of her life, that words spoken by a dying wife directly to her husband's face can feel unbearably heavy in the moment, too raw, too final, the kind of thing a man still fighting with everything he had to keep her might not be able to fully receive while he was still holding on so tight. His knuckles went white. So she had done something else instead, something quieter and stranger and, he now understood, braver. She had planted those 4 words into a living thing that couldn't die on any schedule she could control, something that would carry them forward past her own last breath and deliver them on a day she couldn't predict but somehow trusted would come, a day when Daniel would finally be ready, or at least ready enough, to actually let them in without the words drowning in the noise of fresh grief. Tell him he was enough. Not I love you, which he'd heard 1,000 times across 41 years and which, as true as it was, might have washed over him in those first raw days without really landing. Not don't forget me, which would have only deepened the wound. Something far more specific, far more precisely aimed at exactly him. Like she knew precisely what quiet doubt would gnaw at her husband once she was gone, the fear that had lived in him for years without either of them ever naming it out loud at the dinner table, the fear that somehow, across 4 decades of an ordinary life, of freight routes and mortgage payments and vacations they couldn't quite afford to take, of missed school plays and long hauls that kept him away for a week at a time, he hadn't been enough of a husband, enough of a man, enough of a life for a woman who deserved the whole world and got him instead. The struggle that followed in the weeks after that afternoon wasn't a struggle of disbelief, because Daniel no longer doubted what he'd heard or what it meant, not for a single second. Not even lying awake at 3 a.m, turning it over and over in his mind, the way he once might have. It was the harder struggle of learning to actually live inside that gift, instead of just receiving it once and letting the moment pass him by. Like everything else grief had already taken from him, without asking permission. He found himself returning to the sunroom every single day, not out of obligation now the way he'd once refilled a water dish out of guilt, but out of something closer to hunger. Sitting beside Chester's cage for long stretches of the afternoon with his coffee going cold beside him, sometimes talking to the bird the exact way Margaret used to, softly, patiently, telling him about his day, the way you'd tell a spouse, sometimes just sitting in silence, waiting to hear those 4 words come again, like a man waiting for a phone to ring. And Chester gave them to him, not constantly, not on command like some parlor trick performed for visitors, but at moments that felt almost uncannily well-timed. He'd hear that gravelly little voice drift in from the sunroom, unbidden, tell him he was enough, and something in his chest would crack open just wide enough to let a sliver of light in alongside the grief. the way morning light finds its way through a crack in a curtain that's been drawn too long. His daughters were skeptical at first when he told them over the phone, gently suggesting, the way loving daughters do, that maybe he was hearing what he needed to hear, that maybe grief does strange things to a tired mind that's been under this much strain. He didn't argue with them about it, didn't get defensive the way he might have once. He understood exactly why they'd say it, because he would have said the very same thing himself 6 months earlier, sitting across the table from some other grieving man telling this exact story. But he had been a practical man his entire life, a man who trusted only what he could measure with his own 2 hands, weigh on a scale, hold up to the light, and he knew now, with a certainty that genuinely surprised him, that this was no trick of his own grieving mind. This was Margaret, reaching across the only door she had left open to him, and Daniel decided, somewhere in the middle of that struggle, sitting alone in that sunroom night after night, that he would not let skepticism, not even his own old familiar skepticism that had served him well for 68 years, talk him out of the one true comfort that was actually, finally working. The breakthrough came almost 2 months after the funeral, on a night Daniel would later describe to his daughters as the night he finally exhaled all the way for the first time since Margaret first got sick the previous spring. He'd gone looking that evening for an old shoebox of Margaret's tucked in the top of the bedroom closet, thinking it might hold photographs for a memorial slideshow his younger daughter Susan wanted to put together for the 1-year mark, something to show at a small gathering of family friends. Instead, standing on a step stool and reaching blind into the back corner of that shelf, he pulled down a box he didn't recognize, and buried beneath old receipts and greeting cards and ticket stubs from movies he barely remembered seeing together, he found a small spiral notebook, the cheap kind you'd buy for $2 at any drugstore checkout, with Margaret's careful cursive filling the first several pages in blue ink that had started to fade slightly at the edges. It was dated back to that spring, right around the time of her diagnosis, and it was written directly to him, though she'd clearly never intended to hand it over while she was still alive to see his face reading it, tucked away where she knew he wouldn't find it. In it, she'd written about her fear of dying before she'd said everything she still needed to say, about small resentments she'd carried quietly for years and never once mentioned out loud, the vacations they never quite managed to take because money was always a little tight, the years he worked too many long hauls, and she raised the girls mostly on her own at that kitchen table, folding laundry alone on Friday nights while he was somewhere on a highway in Indiana. And yet she'd written, and Daniel had to stop reading for a moment here, his hands shaking too hard to hold the notebook steady, lying awake next to him even during those hardest years. She never once doubted for a single night that she had married the right man. Near the final entry, dated only weeks before hospice began in earnest, she'd written about Chester, about her plan, half a joke and half deadly serious, to teach that bird a message meant only for Daniel, because she was terrified that if she said the words to his face during her last days, grief would swallow them whole before they ever truly landed the way she needed them to. He needs to hear it when he isn't drowning, she'd written in that careful, familiar hand he'd know anywhere. He needs to hear it on an ordinary day, not a dying one. Chester will know when. Daniel sat right there on the floor of that closet, his back against the wall of hanging clothes, still smelling faintly of her, reading those words with tears running freely down his face, not the sharp tears of fresh devastation this time, but something gentler, something closer to relief, like a burden he hadn't fully known he was carrying, had finally, quietly been set down after months of dragging it around, without realizing how heavy it had gotten. The emotional climax of it all came the following weekend, when Daniel invited both his daughters home, not for another round of grief and casserole dishes and careful, tiptoeing conversation, but because he wanted them to hear it themselves, to understand fully what their mother had done for him in her final months on this earth. He gathered them in the sunroom, in the same late afternoon light Margaret used to love so much, the light coming in low and gold through the window across her empty chair, and he told them the whole story from the very beginning, the secret lessons at the kitchen table he'd once resented without saying so, the closed door that had stung more than he'd admitted. His older daughter Rebecca, the practical one who took after Daniel in nearly everything, right down to the set of her jaw, sat with her arms crossed tight across her chest, clearly fighting the same instinct to explain it all away. Rationally, that Daniel himself had felt in the very beginning, searching for some logical trick of memory or coincidence. But when Chester, entirely unprompted, right in the middle of Daniel's telling, tilted his head toward the three of them gathered there and said it again, "Tell him he was enough," in that unmistakable cadence, unmistakably their mother's own rhythm carried through a bird's rough little voice across the quiet room. Both daughters broke down completely, and so did Daniel. It was, Daniel would say for years afterward, whenever someone asked him about it at church or over coffee, the closest he had ever come in his whole life to standing in the same room as an actual, undeniable miracle. In the months that followed, the resolution of all this wasn't dramatic in the way movies sometimes make grief look. No sudden overnight transformation. No single morning where Daniel simply woke up healed and whole again like flipping a switch. It was quieter than that, and truer for it, the way most real healing is. Daniel kept Chester right there in the sunroom, kept his own quiet routine of sitting with him every single morning over coffee, before the sun was even fully up. And the bird kept offering up that phrase at moments that still felt, even years later, too precisely timed to ever be pure coincidence. On his and Margaret's wedding anniversary in June, when Daniel found himself standing in front of her photograph on the mantel, on the morning of what would have been her 65th birthday when he'd woken up already crying before he even opened his eyes. On one particularly rough night when Daniel's back pain kept him wide awake at 3 a.m. Slowly, gradually, over the better part of a year, the phrase stopped being only a message from the past and became something more like a steady companion for whatever road still lay ahead of him. A reminder he could return to whenever the old doubt tried to creep back in through the cracks the way it still sometimes did, whenever he found himself wondering late at night if 41 years of an ordinary, imperfect, deeply human marriage had truly been enough for a woman like her, a woman who could have had anyone and chose him. He started sleeping through the night again for the first time in over a year and a half. He started calling his daughters just to talk, not out of grief-driven obligation, but because he genuinely simply wanted to hear their voices on the other end of the line, wanted to know how his grandchildren were doing in school, wanted to be a father again instead of just a man surviving one day at a time. He began, in small and unhurried ways, rebuilding a life that still had Margaret woven all through every corner of it, in the garden he kept up now himself, in the recipes he'd started attempting from her handwritten cards, in the Sunday drives he took alone past places they used to go together, but a life that finally, mercifully, had room enough. Daniel is 70 now, and Chester still lives in that same sunroom, a little grayer around his old eyes, his feathers a touch duller than they used to be, but still healthy, still sharp as ever, with a natural lifespan that could easily carry him another 30 years, long past Daniel's own remaining time on this earth. A thought that used to unsettle him, and now, somehow, brings him a strange comfort instead. Daniel has already put arrangements in his will for one of his daughters to take the bird when his own day eventually comes, so that Margaret's last gift keeps traveling forward, keeps finding whoever in the family needs to hear it next when their own hard season arrives, whether that's Rebecca. He tells people now, without a trace of the embarrassment he might once have felt admitting something so unprovable out loud at a barbershop or a church coffee hour, that his wife found a way to keep loving him even after she was gone from this world, that she trusted a bird with no earthly idea what the words meant to carry, the one thing she was afraid grief would swallow whole if she'd tried to say it herself in those final days. He no longer needs the daily reassurance the way he did in those first raw, disbelieving weeks after the funeral. But every so often, on some ordinary afternoon, sitting in his chair with the local paper folded on his lap, or staring quietly out at the yard she used to tend so faithfully every single summer, he'll hear that familiar rasp drift over from the corner of the room. Patient and entirely unhurried, and he lets himself believe, fully now and without a shred of apology to anyone who might doubt him, that some part of the people we love the most simply refuses to leave us all the way. That love finds its own strange and stubborn doorways when the ordinary ones finally close for good. And that maybe, in the end, that's the... Have you ever felt someone you lost reach you again, in a way you never expected? Through an animal, a song, a smell, a moment too precise to ever call plain coincidence? And if you have a Chester of your own, a dog, a cat, a horse, a bird, who still carries some piece of somebody you love deep inside them, what would you give right now, tonight, to hear that voice just one more time? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and we would be genuinely honored to hear your story too, whatever it is. And if stories like this one, about the bonds between people and the animals who carry them through the hardest days of their lives, mean something real to you, hit that subscribe button, because we bring you a brand new story just like this one in every single video, and we would love nothing more than to have you here with us for the next one.